When we talk about treating relational trauma, there are generally two different approaches, what we call the top-down approach or the bottom-up approach. Now, both can be effective and both have their place in trauma treatment. Today, we're going to walk through some of the different types of trauma and trauma treatments, the steps involved in the bottom-up or the top-down, as well as some of the differences between the two. Now, because I will be describing some of the neuroscience involved in the different parts of the brain, don't be turned off by that. Don't be scared by that. It's not really that important whether you remember the part of the brain or its anatomical function. What's really important, and what I want you to take away from this more than anything, really is the understanding of how trauma treatment flows either from the top down or the bottom up. And that's really important because we need to know that information when we're talking about or dealing with trauma triggers or when we're trying to heal our trauma. Welcome to Trauma-Free Relationship. I'm Tom Philp, your host, and as a therapist, I've spent over 10,000 hours helping couples work through their trauma so they can repair ruptures, heal their wounds, and communicate from a place of wholeness and connection. Let's get started. Okay, as I said in the opening, we're going to talk today about two different approaches to trauma treatment, what we call the top-down approach or the bottom-up approach. One is not necessarily better than the other, although I will say that there is something called an incubator effect when we're talking about working from the bottom up, and I'll explain that in just a little bit. But let's just walk through for a moment what the top-down versus the bottom-up is. And essentially, I'm going to be describing 5 different areas of the brain that then connect to our body, and it's the same way, the same description, the same parts of our brain go top down, and then you just reverse that and it's bottom up. So you'll see what I mean here in a minute. So a top-down approach. So essentially a top-down approach would start with what we call the prefrontal cortex. Now that's the area of the brain that sits right behind your forehead. This is a very important area of the brain. It's a couple of the different structures are the medial prefrontal cortex, the anterior cingulate cortex, as well as the insula. And the prefrontal cortex, that area of your brain, is responsible for complex cognitive functionings like decision-making, planning, working memory, reasoning, impulse control, social behavior regulation, and to some degree emotional control, as well as empathy. Our ability to empathize with our partner sits in that area of our brain right behind our forehead. So the top part is the prefrontal cortex. Then moving down to the next layer, if you will, is the right hemisphere of your brain. So the right hemisphere is nonverbal and nonlinear, meaning it doesn't necessarily think 2 + 2 is 4. It might see 4, 2 + 2 is 8 - 6, so on and so forth. And so it's not involved a lot in our language or in necessarily mathematical calculations. Our right hemisphere is involved a lot in creativity. It's that part of our brain that tries to step outside the box, that maybe wants to reinvent the wheel, that really wants to be able to explore and express ourselves in ways that open us up and aren't sort of boxed in or confined to prescriptive roles. That's a great function of our right hemisphere. But it's very different than our left hemisphere, which is very verbal driven. Now, there's a set of nerve fibers between the left and the right hemisphere that actually helps us transfer that information between the two halves of our brain. All right, so if we move down to the next step, then what we have is an area of the brain called the limbic system. And this area is comprised of the amygdala, the hippocampus, as well as the hypothalamus. And the limbic system is the primary system that houses our emotions. It also the system that houses the attachment drive as well. So very important. Now, the limbic system is fully developed from the time of birth. So just think about that for a moment. The emotional part of our brain is fully developed by the time we exit the womb. Now think about how long it is before we first start putting our experiences into words, not only to ourselves, but being able to speak words to others. You've got probably 18, if not 24 months of life and lived experience that is all housed in the limbic system. This is why oftentimes psychologists say the first 2 years of life are so important, because we're absorbing all of this information about our world and our relationships before we ever have the ability to put it into words. So the limbic system is very important in trauma treatment because oftentimes the limbic system is the area of the brain that gets lit up when our trauma gets triggered. And the prefrontal cortex, which is the very first thing I mentioned, the very top of this tier, if you will, that typically oftentimes goes offline. I hate to use computer analogies, but in some cases it really does fit. And so what we have is if your trauma gets triggered, your limbic system lights up, and your prefrontal cortex, the area about decision-making, working memory, reasoning, impulse control, it tends to go dark under images of the brain. And what it means is that your neurons aren't firing that area when I say it's going dark. So your limbic system is really lighting up. It's very colorful because all of a sudden there's tons of firing in that part of your brain. All right, let's go down to the next layer, and that's the brainstem and the thalamus. Now, the brainstem acts as a control center for vital life functions like breathing, heart rate, blood pressure, while the thalamus serves as a relay station, receiving information from the body and sending it to the appropriate areas of the brain to be processed. So think about that for a moment. Think about how the brainstem helps your heart rate go up or go down. It helps monitor your blood pressure as well as your breathing. When your trauma gets triggered, when you start going into a panic attack, that's because that area of your brain is lighting up like crazy. Your heart rate jumps from 60 beats per minute to perhaps over 100 beats per minute. Your blood pressure begins to drop. Your breathing begins to increase, and it becomes difficult to catch your breath. All of that is happening in the brainstem. And again, it's happening without the ability for you to engage your prefrontal cortex. So your ability at that point to say, well, I just need to calm down, or this will be okay, this will pass, I'll be all right in a few minutes. It's hard to access that stuff when your brainstem is lit up the way it is. And then finally, of course, we have the body. So all of these four other functions I talked about in the brain ultimately are all connected to the body as well through the thalamus, which is sort of, as I said, that relay station. It receives information from the body, sends it to the right parts of the brain to be processed, or the brain then sends information back down to the body to be processed as well. So if we just name these different areas, we can go from the top down. The top starting with prefrontal cortex, the right hemisphere of the brain, the limbic system, the brainstem and thalamus to the body. The bottom up would simply be in reverse. The body, then the brainstem and thalamus, then the limbic system, then the right hemisphere, finally up to the prefrontal cortex. Again, that area right behind the forehead of your brain. So that is a little bit about what I mean when I say top down versus bottom up. So there's two essentially different ways that we can approach treating trauma. We can approach it from the top down. So trauma treatment approaches that focus on the top down are focusing a lot on cognitive processing, are focusing on thought patterns aimed to change behaviors by addressing the negative thoughts or beliefs held within them. Some examples of that would be cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavior therapy, and what is called cognitive processing therapy. Essentially working with the thinking part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, as I mentioned, to manage trauma symptoms. Now, there's absolutely a place for this approach in treating trauma. And part of that place is oftentimes it is very difficult for people to be able to tune in, to go inwards, and to identify parts of their body and sit with those sensations because the trauma has been so severe. They've never had anybody there to be able to help them sit with those feelings, manage those feelings, contain those feelings long enough to gain the relevant information from it, that they quickly have sort of cut off their body from their brain, so to speak. I don't mean literally, I just mean they've created this disassociation so they are not embodied in terms of how they process and can experience their own emotions. So a lot of times in dealing with trauma symptoms, a top-down approach can be very effective and can be very helpful. But then, of course, there's also the bottom-up approach as well. And the bottom-up approach to treatment focuses directly on addressing the body's physical sensations and the physiological responses to trauma, rather than primarily focusing on the cognitive thoughts. By utilizing techniques like mindfulness, sensory awareness, and movement to help process and regulate traumatic experiences that can be stored in the body. Some examples of the bottom-up style of treatment are somatic experiencing, or SE, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, EMDR, sensory motor psychotherapy, as well as yoga therapy. Again, these can be really important and really effective in trauma treatment because what you're doing is helping the person, the victim of trauma, be able to hold and connect to their body where trauma is most remembered. Bessel van der Kolk wrote a very famous book, probably the Bible, if you will, of trauma treatment called The Body Keeps the Score. And he named it for a reason, because out of years and years of research, him and many other colleagues have done, we finally have begun to realize and can show repeatedly in experiences that the body oftentimes is holding trauma separate from our cognitive understanding of it. So when we get triggered, what that means is that the area of our brain, most oftentimes the limbic system, the right hemisphere as well as the brain stem, those areas of our brain begin to light up. It engages the body. It feels very painful. We want to get rid of that painful experience as quickly as possible. And so either we turn in on ourselves, we begin attacking ourselves, or we turn out and we begin attacking others. And so it's really sort of that fight or flight, sometimes freeze experience. Sometimes we can disassociate where we don't feel anything at all, or we feel like we're having an out-of-body experience, like we're not really embodied in that sense. We can't feel our own physical sensations. And so all of that is extremely important in the bottom-up approach to trauma treatment. Again, I really want to emphasize here, don't get hung up on the areas of the brain I'm talking about. The definitions, the areas aren't that important. If you want, you can go back and you can listen to several times or jot it down if it's really important to you. But what I want you to take away from this is that both are important in the treatment of trauma. There is a place for bottom-up approaches to healing. And I mentioned earlier something called an incubator effect. What I mean by that is that we tend to see approaches that work from the bottom up, that work from the body up to the brainstem and thalamus, up to the limbic system, the emotional center of our brain, up through the right hemisphere, and then over to the prefrontal cortex. Those approaches tend to have a longer healing rate or healing effect than just the top-down approaches do. I'm not saying it's necessarily better. What I'm saying is that we seem to we can measure how long treatment can be effective for, and the rate of effectiveness tends to last longer for bottom-up approaches than it does top-down. That's what it's called, the incubator effect. It's kind of like, babies in an incubator are kept warmer for longer periods of time when they need that, and so it's very helpful in that regard. Again, I'm not advocating one versus the other. In my treatment with couples and in dealing with trauma, I absolutely use both. Because both is applicable and both is called for. There are sometimes one partner of a couple that I'm trying to help treat where they simply just cannot let themselves sit with the emotions in their body. And if that's the case, okay, then I might start with the top down. This is especially true with more avoidant style of attachment. I may work with a partner who has more avoidant style, and she may need me to work starting top down, starting with some of the symptoms, starting with some of the implicit narratives that she holds and cognitive beliefs that she holds about herself and in her relationship before we can get down to a place where she can begin to resonate with sensations in her body, begin to understand what those feel like, where it hits her, and then understand the deeper meanings and stories she tells herself about those feelings. Whereas another partner, I can absolutely dive in and I can start working from bottom up. They might be really good at being able to identify sensations in their body, and this can be true very much with anxious styles of attachment. They usually can feel a lot of feelings in their body. Sometimes it's they can't separate certain feelings out. They can't create discrete feelings. Well, it just feels like it's just all anxiety. Okay, is there any sort of hurt, or does it feel more painful? Does it reside more in your chest, or does it just hit you in the stomach, or where might that be? So helping them being able to separate emotions out can be some of a challenge sometimes with anxious style, but nonetheless, oftentimes they can more readily access their body and access the deeper layers of meanings to what those sensations are telling them about their experience with their partner. So, as I said, both are very important. Both are extremely applicable and necessary in treating trauma. If you find yourself in trauma treatment and your therapist is working from bottom up, I hope this explains a little bit about the understanding and the science behind why your therapist is doing that. If your therapist is working from top down, I hope this explains a little bit about that process as well. Hopefully they've explained it to you that you're not in the dark about that. Surely not. Surely they've explained how they're working and some of the reasoning behind it. But nonetheless, I hope this can sort of shine a light on your experience in that. When your partner comes to you and they're able to just join you in a painful emotion, and they might not use any words, but maybe it's a touch that resonates in your body. Your partner is showing up for you and lending them their central nervous system to help you regulate yours. And that would be sort of a bottom-up approach to helping you regulate yourself in those moments if you're hurting or you're going to a dark place if your trauma gets triggered. If your partner comes to you and is able to sort of be calm and cognitive and reasoning, then they're using more of a top-down approach. And that can be very helpful with somebody who might be freaking out in the moment. And so, as I said a dozen times here, and I need to say it again because I do think it's important, one is not better than the other. They're both necessary in the treatment of trauma, and both show up and play out in our closest relationships. Okay, well, I hope this was helpful. Thank you so much for joining us today. I really love bringing these to you. And if you have any questions or if there's anything you want to hear in particular, don't be afraid to reach out. So until next time, we'll talk to you then.
Thank you for listening to Trauma-Free Relationship, a podcast for the healing of attachment trauma. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, or our website at traumafreerelationship.com. Be sure to look for our next episode on your favorite streaming